Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Luke. I am a lecturer in criminology here at Staffordshire University. Today I'm just going to do a relatively quick talk on various elements of my PhD research, which was funded by the ESRC and which I submitted around 6 or so weeks ago now. My PhD then looked at the rise of nationalism in a relatively deprived area on Teesside in the northeast of England, and to do this I interviewed 14 Brexit voters, 9 non-voters and 1 Remain voter. When we think about nationalism, Brexit is a clear indicator of that in England. Many of the areas across the northeast and Midlands that historically supported Labour, that were built up around industrial work, well-paid industrial jobs, and that have witnessed the shift to an insecure service economy, voted to leave the EU in 2016, and of course elected a Conservative MP for in many cases the first time in their history in December last year. 9 non-voters then, the reason for that was because when we think about politics over the last few decades, one of the core aspects of it is that people have withdrawn from the political field. They feel as though politicians don't represent them, that they're all self-interested, that no matter who you elect, whether that be Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats and so on, they're all the same. They all offer this kind of empty rhetoric and sound bites about wanting to protect the working class's economic interests. They want to invest in jobs and so on, but when they get elected they totally abandon their pledges, or in some cases perform a complete U-turn. One Remain voter then, the reason for that was it was interesting to see the similarities between non-voters, Brexit voters, and the Remain voters in terms of how they felt about society and politics, and what that collective opinions, collective sentiments can tell us about the future. Now, although this research was undertaken in Teesside, it's important to note that there are many similarities to Stoke-on-Trent. As I mentioned, both Teesside and Stoke were historically, or should I say, historically a core aspect of their local economy was steel making, was mining, and Stoke, of course, the pottery industry. Both areas have historically elected a Labour MP, both voted for Brexit in 2016, and Stoke-on-Trent, of course, like some areas on Teesside, elected a Conservative MP in 2019. Okay, so the elements of my PhD research I'll talk about today is the dissatisfaction about the loss of well-paid industrial jobs, a sense of discontent and unease with some of the conditions in the labour market today around insecurity, uncertainty, a kind of loss of power for employees at work, and what I believe to be the political outcome of this, which was the 2016 Brexit vote, which of course many areas across the northeast and indeed the Midlands, these relatively deprived localities, elected to leave by a significant margin. For instance, on Teesside, it contains one of the areas is the collected the proportionally highest leave vote in Britain. I think it was around 80% in that specific locale voted to leave a couple of years ago. So I argue that in order to understand how people feel about politics and society, we need to return to history. We need to understand people's lives in the context of history, current conditions in the social world, and how this combines to create certain opinions and sentiments. Okay, so many of my participants who I interviewed in my research were born in the post-war period. Some of them were between 40 and 60 years of age. Now, the post-war era, relatively speaking, was between 1945 and 1979. They argued that things seemed to work better back then. There was this very common notion across the whole interview sample that it was easier to obtain work then. You could pack in a job on Friday, you could start another one on Monday. There was never really any kind of worry about obtaining well-paid industrial employment. This idea of economic insecurity, about worrying to pay the bills, about worrying to obtain a job, didn't really enter their collective psyche back then. They could walk from one job to another. Many also spoke about possessing a degree of power at work, because they had trade unions, particularly in industry, that gave them a bargaining tool at work. So they spoke about how if their employer was trying to reduce their pay or not give them a pay rise that they perceived to be entitled to, or kind of bringing about conditions in the workplace that was against their economic interests, they would go to their trade union representative and seek to do something about this. There was also a sense of collective resistance amongst workers. Workers were identified as a source of strength, a source of kind of collective obligation and trust and reciprocal relations. So they had shared interests in some ways. It's not to be romantic about industrial work. It was, working at the steelworks was very difficult. It was very dirty. It was extremely demanding. It was often 12-hour shifts, 4 days a week, but then some of them spoke about how they would work 4 and then have 4 days off. But not to be too idealized, but they did say that job, working in industry, was the best days of their life. Interestingly, many also spoke about their community back then, that they would spend time with their neighbours, that they would kind of invest in one another. One participant, for instance, told me about how her children would run in and out of a next door neighbour's garden, particularly on the weekends. They were like surrogate grandchildren, is the term that she used. So there was a sense of mutual obligation, of trust, of community spirit in certain working class localities. And as I've put on a slide there, this area contains parallels to Stoke-on-Trent, which I've already mentioned. Okay, so I spoke to Sarah about these trends, and she voted leave. She's a part-time nurse. Her husband used to work at the steelworks, but he lost his job in 2015. He was unemployed for about a year, which is obviously a pretty long time, and we know that people that are unemployed, the longer they are unemployed, the more difficult it is for them to get a job. He eventually obtained work, but she said it's nowhere near the pay as he was receiving at the steelworks. She's historically voted for Labour, and she told me, when I was a kid, I remember my dad working at tarmac and all over. If he was on the dole, it would only be for a few weeks and he would have work again, whereas now it's like a big repetitive cycle, people putting out CVs and going for interviews, and there is nothing. Like, I remember being a kid during the miners' strike, my dad going out and collecting money for the wives of the families, and stuff like that, like a feeling of community. Okay, so in many ways she describes the labour market conditions then and labour market conditions now, how it seems to be very difficult to easily obtain work now, that there's not enough jobs, that demand for jobs outstrips supply, particularly in these areas like Teesside that were built up around industrial work. She mentions the very infamous miners' strike, which was between 1984 and 1985, which lasted for over a year and which of course the miners eventually lost. But importantly, she describes a sense of common purpose and shared interests that was associated with that era. Okay, so as I mentioned then, these cultural elements were substantiated by well-paid employment in the local area. Particularly on Teesside, there was an employer called ICI, which stands for Imperial Chemicals Industry. It was formed in the 1920s and they had 2 sites on Teesside at Wilton and Billingham, and as far back as the mid-1970s, that one employer, ICI, employed about 35,000 people in the area. It offered really well-paid jobs, great, if you were employed there, you had opportunities for career progression. You would have what was regarded as a job for life. It was not uncommon for people to work at one employer for 30 years, 40 years in some cases. They would spend their whole employment lives there. Again, they spoke about having a great sense of pride and purpose from their work. When you asked them about it, they would often say, I was really proud to work there. I was proud to be a steel worker. So a great sense of identity and indeed social function from their employment. Again, people spoke about as well how their co-worker was a source of collective strength, that they would also spend time with them outside of work hours. In many ways that their workers didn't live far from them. Some even mentioned how they often lived on the same street. So there was a sense of social and economic security back then. They didn't have to worry about not paying the bills. They had enough disposable income to put into savings and indeed into leisure practices. And they could plan for the future. That the visions of the future that they collectively had was one of optimism and positivity. So Sarah is now in her 50s. She voted leave. She worked at ICI for quite a while, as did her husband, who obtained a really well-paid job there. And she voted leave a couple of years ago. And when I was talking to her about industrial employment, she said ICI was really great. It was just a great company to work for, and I think retrospectively you realise how good it was. You don't realise how good you've got it until it's gone. That's what I think. Looking back on it, it was like a huge family. If you had a job for ICI, it was for life, and some people did. It was perfect. When I was young, I just really wanted to work for ICI. I went for an interview in telecommunications. I didn't get the job, but the lady said, we will keep your interview on file. I thought, well, okay, thanks, but that's the end of it, and I was really disappointed. But a year later, they came back to me and offered me the job. That would not happen anywhere today, but you weren't forgotten, you were respected and looked after. There is just nothing like it anymore. It is such a shame. So again, these sentiments kind of consolidate some of the social trends that I've been briefly talking about. She felt looked after in employment, in in her job role. She felt as though employees were looked after and cared for, and that these times have gone. They're just a memory with every passing year further subside from her and working classes collective psyche. Okay, so as I mentioned then, the steelworks closed in 2015 on Teesside. I'm sure many of you will have seen it on the news. So deindustrialisation is a lengthy process. Okay, the last mine on Teesside, for instance, closed in the mid-1960s. It was over 720 feet deep. It was a huge mine. But deindustrialisation unfolds in several waves. Okay, so ICI, for instance, massively downsized its workforce throughout the 80s and 90s, and in 2007, I think, the famous name was lost from Teesside as it was completely sold off. And the latest kind of phase of deindustrialisation in the area was the steelworks closure a couple of years ago. So it did have some structural problems. For instance, when it was built in 1979, there was a report that came out that contained 5 core proposals for the steelworks, and only 2 were implemented, which basically meant, it couldn't transform the product into the finished piece. Okay, so it had to be transported elsewhere, which massively increased production costs. And it was mothballed a couple of years before 2015, so there's a massive uncertainty surrounding it for a considerable length of time. But when it did shut in 2015, over 2,000 people lost their jobs, really well paid, unionised and skilled employment, as well as many more in the local supply chains. Now, many of my research participants attended protests, which was organised by workers and the local community and local Labour Party MPs. Some of them said about at the Middlesbrough football games they had banners saying "Save our steel," but many spoke about, nothing happened. We engaged in all this, we put our energy into it, but the powers that be, which was the Conservative government at the time, just ignored our requests and concerns. So this is, in many ways, they expressed what Mark Fisher, a social theorist, termed reflexive impotence. So they reflected, they realised that things were bad. If this is going to close, it's going to put lots of people out of work. It's going to be really bad for the local economy. But they expressed a sense of impotence. Yeah, they couldn't do anything about it. This is just how it is these days. The area's been losing these jobs for a long period of time. So some steelworkers underwent retraining and acquired kind of additional skills, but this was in stuff like beginners for IT, which didn't really hold much value in the local economy. Interestingly, many spoke about how they would attend job fairs in the local area, but they would turn up and put the name down and fill in forms, and then the employer would say, well, we'll get in touch with you if there are any jobs, but at the moment we don't have any jobs at all. So many spoke about the kind of confusion about that. Why were they informed to go along to these job fairs when actually there wasn't really any jobs available? Some were fortunate enough to obtain work in what remained of the local chemical industry, and some went to work offshore, the Aberdeen oil rigs. If you read a book by Jonathan Warren, which came out in 2018, called Industrial Lives and Legacy, he makes the point that around 3,000 people from Teesside work offshore, and if the people working offshore have got really well-paid jobs. However, there was those that were not so fortunate and lucky. Many of them ended up in jobs that, they were earning £50,000 at the steelworks, which is obviously a really good wage, and they obtained a job that, one of them said was about £20,000. One of them, for instance, was delivering local prescriptions in the area, which again offered none of the kind of positivity and pride and purpose that the steelworks once offered people. I spoke to one lass and she told me that it's very bad for the area. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lass I went to school with, her husband killed himself over it. It was really bad, really sad. So some people couldn't cope with the profound distress and upheaval that this event brought about to their lives. Not just that then, but the generational tradition of sons following in their father's footsteps and obtaining a decent, well-paid industrial job ceased to exist in the area. A young lad told me, for instance, about how his dad worked there, his uncle and his granddad, and now that opportunity to kind of follow in their footsteps had been taken away from him as the steelworks closed. So many of the jobs in the area now are poorly paid, they're non-unionised, and the sense of pride and identity that industrial work once brought has evaporated. For example, between the 1970s and 2000s, the area lost about 100,000 manufacturing jobs and gained about 92,000 jobs in the service economy. Now, obviously, there are pockets of good employment. There's still some good jobs here and there, but we speak about general trends, and the general trend is one of decline, non-unionisation, much poorly paid, and particularly at the lower end in stuff like call centres, they're often characterised by a very high turnover of staff. Okay, so Craig used to work at ICI, he voted leave. His brother lost his job at the steelworks in 2015, and he told me that it's devastation for the area. It has a massive knock-on effect from suppliers to electricians, mechanical engineers. It's just so sad, you know what I mean? I know a lot of lads now are still struggling to find work, and where do you go when you're a 50-year-old and it's all you've ever known? It isn't just that, it's taking a life away. It was security at the end of the day. Tom then is self-employed. He does quite a few things like window cleaning, putting up fences, and he told me directly it didn't affect me, but indirectly through my work, window cleaning and other bits, it did badly. From my point of view, work-wise, it hit me a lot financially. I was probably a spin-off of the 5,000 people who were affected. I know about 20 families around here who used to be my customers who aren't now, equally people who had lost their jobs and moved away. I am not saying we are as bad as the villages of the mining era, where we will never get over it, but it was bad. Okay, so some of these long-term trends then I believe hold the key to understanding the Brexit vote. Many of them spoke about how when Brexit came about in 2016, they viewed it as a historic opportunity to intervene and kind of avert the decline that the area has been on for many years. They've seen it as a once in a lifetime opportunity as well to defy the political establishment who they believe didn't listen to them, that these trends continued, that they had little power at work, the area continued to lose what remained of its small industrial base, and this was a chance for them to kind of inform them that they still exist and that they want the area to improve economically and socially. So as I mentioned at the beginning, while my research was conducted in Teesside, it contains similarities to Stoke-on-Trent, but also many areas across the Western world. Think since the 2008 financial crisis, the core political development has been a rise in nationalist sentiments, a desire to put the domestic country first. You see this in the United States of America, where Donald Trump was elected in 2016. He got an awful lot of support from areas in the states that have been termed the Rust Belt, which were formerly erected around steelworks, but have witnessed a loss of well-paid jobs and been abandoned. Again, we've also seen the rise of some of these sentiments across Germany, in Holland, Spain, even in some very historically liberal and tolerant states like Sweden. So we're in the midst of profound political change, and the rise of nationalism has been the core development over the last decade or so. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to my small presentation today. If you want to do any more reading around these issues, there are a series of publications there that are definitely worth looking at. Or if you need any more information, or you're interested in some of the things that I've spoke about, please don't hesitate to get in touch at luke.telford@staffs.ac.uk. Okay, thank you very much.